The sound didn't come from anger, it came from power. The crystal glass slipped from Emily Carter's hand and shattered across the marble floor, the sharp echo bouncing through the hallway like something much bigger had just broken, and for a moment no one moved, not the house staff lying against the wall, not the assistant frozen near the staircase, not even Emily herself as her fingers instinctively curled over the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnant belly. Her breath catching halfway between shock and realization as she slowly looked up at the woman standing in front of her, Margaret Carter, perfectly composed, perfectly dressed, her posture untouched by the moment as if nothing unusual had happened, as if this was just another correction, another lesson, another reminder of who truly controlled everything inside this house. The chandelier above cast a cold, flawless light across the polished floor, reflecting fragments of broken glass like scattered stars. And somewhere in the distance a clock ticked, steady and indifferent, marking time in a place where time itself seemed to belong to the Carters. Emily swallowed, her throat dry, her heartbeat loud in her ears, louder than the silence that had settled over the room, and she tried to steady herself without drawing attention, without making it worse, because she had learned that every reaction, every word, every glance could be turned against her, twisted into proof that she didn't belong here. Margaret took a slow step forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble, controlled, deliberate, the kind of sound that carried authority without ever needing to raise its volume, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it sharper. "You need to learn how to carry yourself properly in this family, Emily," she said, as if she were offering advice instead of delivering judgment, as if the entire moment had been a simple misunderstanding instead of something much deeper, something that had been building quietly behind closed doors for months. Emily nodded faintly, not because she agreed, but because she understood the rules, the unspoken structure of survival in a house where appearances mattered more than truth, where silence was often safer than defense, and where the person with the least power was always expected to absorb the impact without question. A faint movement came from the staff nearby, a shift of weight, a glance quickly averted. But no one stepped forward, no one spoke, because everyone in that room understood exactly where they stood in the hierarchy, and more importantly, where they did not. Emily bent slightly, careful, slow, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach as she reached toward the scattered glass, not to clean it, but to give herself something to do, something to focus on. Something that might steady the sudden wave of heat rising behind her eyes, and as she did, she felt it, a small, reassuring movement from within, a quiet reminder that she was not alone, that there was something more important than this room, this moment, this silent pressure pressing in from all sides. Margaret watched her for a second longer, her expression unreadable, then turned slightly, already moving on, already dismissing the moment as resolved, as handled, as beneath further attention. And just as the tension in the room began to shift, just as the silence started to loosen its grip, a sound came. From the far end of the hallway, soft but unmistakable, the click of a door unlocking, and though no one said a word, every person in that space felt it instantly. Something had just changed, something unseen, something that had been there all along, waiting. The sound of the door was quiet, almost polite, but it cut through the room with a precision that made every spine straighten, and before anyone turned, before anyone dared to react, a presence filled the hallway in a way that no voice ever could. Daniel Carter stood there, still, composed, his expression unreadable as his eyes moved slowly across the scene, taking in the shattered glass, the rigid posture of the staff, the slight bend in Emily's stance, and finally resting on his mother, who did not flinch, did not step back, did not offer explanation, because Margaret Carter had never needed to explain herself to anyone, not even her son. For a second that felt longer than it should have, no one spoke, and in that silence something subtle shifted, like the air itself had changed direction. Emily felt it before she fully understood it, a tension that was no longer pressing only on her, but stretching across the entire room, connecting everyone to the man now standing at the threshold. Daniel took a step forward, slow, measured, the kind of movement that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway, his shoes barely making a sound against the marble, yet every step seemed louder than the last, echoing in a way that made the silence feel deliberate, controlled, almost constructed. Emily straightened slightly without thinking, her hand still resting protectively over her stomach, her eyes lifting toward him for just a moment before dropping again, unsure, uncertain, because for weeks, maybe longer, she had not known where he stood, not really, not when it came to the quiet things that happened when he was not there, not when it came to the way his mother looked at her, spoke to her, measured her worth in ways that could not be seen but could always be felt. Daniel's gaze moved again, not hurried, not emotional, but precise, as if he were reviewing something he had already studied, something familiar, something expected, and when his eyes settled on the broken glass near Emily's feet, they lingered there just long enough to suggest that he understood more than the moment itself revealed. Margaret spoke first, her tone smooth, controlled. "Daniel, you are home early." As if this were a coincidence, as if nothing in the room required further attention, as if the narrative had already been decided and simply needed to be maintained. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that pause, that deliberate withholding of words, carried more weight than any reaction could have, because it was not hesitation, it was choice. Somewhere behind him, almost unnoticed, another figure appeared briefly at the edge of the hallway, a man in a dark suit holding a slim folder, then stepping back out of sight, a detail so small that most would have missed it, but not entirely insignificant. Daniel finally shifted his focus back to his mother, his voice calm when he spoke, lower than expected, steady. "I was watching," he said, not loudly, not accusingly, but with a clarity that settled into the room like a final piece of a puzzle falling into place, and for the first time, something flickered across Margaret's expression, not fear, not yet, but recognition, as if she understood that this moment was not beginning, it was ending, that whatever had just happened had not been unseen, had not been isolated, and had not been without consequence. Emily's breath caught again, but this time it was different, not from pressure, but from the sudden, fragile possibility that something had changed, that the silence she had lived inside was no longer empty, that someone else had finally heard it, and as Daniel took another step forward, the distance between them closing inch by inch, the entire room seemed to hold itself still, waiting for what would come next. The words did not echo, but they landed, and that was enough, because in a house where everything was controlled, even the smallest shift in tone could redraw the entire balance of power. And now the balance had moved. Margaret's chin lifted slightly, not in defiance, but in habit, the reflex of someone who had never needed to question her authority. "Watching what, exactly?" she asked, her voice still even, still composed, but just a fraction tighter at the edges, a detail so small it would have been invisible to anyone who did not know her as well as Daniel did. He did not answer right away, and that silence stretched again. But this time it was heavier, intentional, as if he were allowing the truth to settle before he spoke it aloud, his gaze drifting briefly toward the hallway behind him, where the suited man now stepped forward just enough to be seen, holding the folder with both hands, waiting, not speaking. Simply present, and that presence alone introduced something new into the room, something procedural, something official. Emily noticed it. The way Margaret's eyes flickered for just a second toward that folder, then back to her son, calculating, adjusting, and for the first time since she had entered this house, Emily realized that Margaret Carter did not control everything, not completely, not anymore. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked a decision already made, not one still forming. "I have been reviewing security footage," he said, his voice steady, not raised, not emotional, just precise. "Not just from today," he added, and the room seemed to tighten again, every person in it becoming acutely aware of their own stillness, their own silence, their own place in what was unfolding. Emily's fingers curled slightly against her dress, her mind trying to catch up with what he was saying, because this was not a reaction, it was something else, something planned, something that had been building quietly behind the surface of days. That had seemed ordinary but now felt like pieces of a larger pattern. Margaret's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough, a subtle narrowing of the eyes, a recalibration. "If you are implying something, Daniel, I suggest you be very clear," she said, and though her tone remained controlled, there was a new layer beneath it, something sharper, something that suggested she understood the direction this was going even if she had not expected the timing. Daniel nodded once, as if acknowledging the request, but not submitting to it. "I am being clear," he replied, his eyes finally meeting hers directly, and for a brief moment, the distance between them felt greater than the length of the hallway. "This has been happening for months," he continued, not looking away, not softening the statement, letting it exist exactly as it was, unedited, undeniable. The words did not need volume to carry impact, they settled into the room like weight, pressing down on every surface, every person, every unspoken understanding that had existed before. This moment, Emily felt it in her chest, not as fear, but as something unfamiliar, something fragile and rising, a sense that the narrative she had been forced into might not be permanent, that the role she had been assigned might not be the only one available to her. The suited man took another small step forward, opening the folder just enough to reveal neatly organized documents, pages marked, prepared, ready. And though no one had yet touched them, their presence alone suggested that this moment was no longer private, no longer contained within the walls of a single conversation, it had already moved beyond that. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, closer now, not to his mother, but to Emily, not touching her, not needing to, but positioning himself in a way that changed the geometry of the room, and in that quiet adjustment, in that subtle realignment, something became unmistakably clear. This was no longer about what had happened, it was about what would happen next. Margaret's gaze shifted from Daniel to the folder and back again, her mind moving quickly behind composed eyes, recalculating, adjusting, searching for control in a situation that no longer followed her script. "You went behind my back," she said, not loudly, not emotionally, but with a measured disbelief that suggested this was the real offense in her world, not what had been done, but that it had been observed without her consent. Daniel did not react to the accusation, did not defend himself, because he was no longer operating within her framework. "I verified what I needed to verify," he replied, his tone unchanged, and that calmness carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because it meant this was no longer a discussion, it was a conclusion. The suited man stepped forward fully now, stopping at a respectful distance, opening the folder with practiced precision and turning it slightly toward Daniel, who did not look down immediately, as if he already knew what it contained, as if the documents were not for him, but for the room, for the moment, for what came next. Emily felt the air shift again, a subtle tightening in her chest that was not fear but anticipation, something she had not allowed herself to feel in this house before, because hope had never been safe here, hope had always been something that could be taken away. But now it lingered, cautious, fragile, waiting. Margaret straightened her posture, reclaiming what she could. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice firm now, the authority returning in measured layers. "Whatever misunderstanding you think you have uncovered can be handled privately." And there it was, the attempt to contain, to minimize, to move everything back into the shadows where she had always held control. Daniel finally glanced at the folder, then back at her. "It was handled privately," he said, and the phrasing was deliberate, past tense, finished. "This is the result," he added, and with a small motion of his hand, the suited man stepped closer, extending the first document outward. No one rushed to take it, but its presence alone shifted the room again, because it represented something formal, something structured, something that did not bend to family dynamics or personal influence. Margaret did not reach for it, but her eyes moved across the page from a distance, scanning, recognizing. And for the first time, a real pause settled into her expression, not calculated, not controlled, but genuine, because this was not a conversation she could redirect, not a moment she could reshape with tone or presence. Emily watched quietly, her breathing steadying as she realized that the silence she had lived inside was being replaced by something else, something that had shape, that had structure, that could not be dismissed with a glance or a word. Daniel shifted slightly again, closer still, his position now unmistakable, not between them, not separating, but aligning, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm, but there was something new beneath it, something firm, something final. "Effective immediately," he said, the words precise, measured, carrying the weight of decision. All discretionary authority tied to the Carter estate has been reassigned. He did not raise his voice, did not emphasize the statement, because he did not need to. The meaning was clear without force. Margaret's eyes lifted sharply to meet his, and for the first time, the control she had held for so long did not fully return, because this was not about emotion, this was about structure, about systems, about decisions that had already been executed. The staff remained perfectly still, but the energy in the room had changed completely, no longer tense in the same way. No longer centered on fear, but on something quieter, something irreversible. Emily stood there, one hand still resting over her stomach, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm, and for the first time since she had entered this house, she did not feel like she was standing alone inside the silence. The words did not need repetition, they settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore, and for a brief moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant ticking of the clock, steady, indifferent, as if marking the exact second a legacy began to shift. Margaret's lips parted slightly, not in shock, but in calculation. Her mind moving quickly through options that no longer seemed available. You cannot simply reassign authority like this. Without discussion, she said, her voice regaining structure, reaching for control through logic, through protocol, through the system she had spent years mastering. But Daniel did not interrupt, did not argue, he simply listened, and that alone changed the dynamic. Because he was no longer reacting to her, he was allowing her to speak into a space where the outcome had already been decided. When she finished, he nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgment. It has already been processed, he said, and the choice of words mattered. Not will be, not might be, but has been, something completed, something irreversible, and the suited man beside him adjusted the folder slightly, turning another page forward, revealing signatures, timestamps, confirmations that existed beyond this room, beyond this moment, beyond anything Margaret could undo with a conversation. Emily felt a subtle shift inside her, not just emotional, but physical, a release of tension she had not realized she had been carrying for months, maybe longer, her shoulders lowering slightly, her breath deepening as the weight of uncertainty began to lift, replaced by something steadier. Something grounded in the reality unfolding in front of her. Margaret's eyes moved again across the documents, this time slower, more deliberate, and though her posture remained upright, the certainty that had once defined her presence began to thin, replaced by something quieter, something that resembled recognition, not of defeat, but of limitation, of boundaries she had not anticipated. This is not how family matters are handled, she said, softer now, not weaker, but more measured, as if choosing each word with greater care, and Daniel's response came just as calmly. This stopped being a family matter a long time ago, he said, and the statement did not carry accusation, it carried clarity, a line drawn not in anger, but in understanding. The staff remained motionless, but their attention was no longer fixed in the same way, it had shifted subtly, no longer anchored to Margaret, but divided, uncertain, adjusting to the new alignment of authority in the room. Emily lifted her gaze again, this time holding it a fraction longer. Looking at Daniel not with hesitation, but with a quiet question, one that did not need to be spoken aloud, and for a brief second, his eyes met hers, not intensely, not dramatically, but enough to acknowledge her presence, enough to confirm that she was no longer invisible in this space. The suited man stepped back slightly after placing the documents on the nearby console table, leaving them there, visible, tangible. A physical representation of what had just been set in motion, and as he did, the room seemed to exhale, not fully, not yet, but enough to signal that the moment had moved past confrontation and into consequence. Daniel adjusted his stance once more, his voice steady as he spoke again. There will be a transition period, he said, not as a negotiation, but as a statement of process. But effective today, decisions regarding this household and the estate will no longer go through you. And the finality of it settled into the space between them, not loud, not forceful, but absolute. Margaret did not respond immediately, and in that pause something unspoken passed through the room, a recognition that the structure everyone had known, relied on, feared, had just changed, and Emily stood there, her hand still resting gently over her stomach, feeling the steady movement beneath her palm, realizing that for the first time, the future did not feel like something she had to endure, but something that might finally belong to her. Margaret's silence did not break immediately, and that alone carried a weight no one in the room had ever witnessed before, because she had always been the one to fill silence, to control it, to bend it to her will, but now it lingered around her, unmoved, and for the first time it did not belong to her. Her gaze shifted slowly across the room, not in uncertainty, but in assessment. As if she were mapping the new boundaries that had been drawn without her consent, her eyes pausing briefly on the staff, who now stood with a different kind of stillness, no longer tense in the same way, no longer anchored solely to her presence, and that subtle change was enough to confirm what the documents had already made clear. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, not diminished, but altered. "You are making a mistake," she said, and though the words carried conviction, they no longer carried command. They existed as opinion, not authority. Daniel did not move, did not react outwardly. But something in his posture shifted slightly, a grounding, a final settling into the decision he had already made. "No," he replied, his tone steady. "I am correcting one." And the distinction was subtle but absolute, and it landed in the space between them with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. Emily felt her breath catch again, but this time it was not from tension, it was from the realization that this moment was not temporary, that it was not something that would be reversed once emotion settled. It was structural, permanent, and that understanding moved through her slowly, like light entering a room that had been dim for too long. Margaret's eyes flickered once more toward the documents, then back to Daniel, and for a brief second, something unguarded appeared, not weakness, but recognition, the kind that comes when a long-held position is no longer supported by the ground beneath it. "And what happens now?" she asked, and the question was different from anything she had said before. It was not a challenge, not a directive, but a request for information, a shift so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, but in this room, in this moment, it changed everything. Daniel answered without hesitation, because he had already considered it, already planned it. "There will be new oversight," he said, his voice even, measured, external, independent. And as he spoke, the suited man inclined his head slightly, confirming without words that the process was already in motion, already beyond discussion. Emily's hand tightened gently against her dress, her mind catching each word, each shift, each piece of a reality she had not allowed herself to imagine before, because imagining it had always felt dangerous, unrealistic. Something that could be taken away the moment she believed in it. Margaret drew in a slow breath, her shoulders remaining straight, her composure intact, but no longer unchallenged, no longer absolute, and when she spoke again, her tone carried a new quality, something more measured, more contained. "And my role?" she asked, and there was no hesitation in Daniel's response. "You will retain your title," he said, not unkindly, not harshly, but clearly. "But not your authority." And the distinction settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one could ignore. The staff remained silent, but their attention had shifted completely now, no longer waiting for Margaret's direction, but observing, adjusting, aligning themselves with the new structure taking shape in front of them. Emily lifted her gaze again, this time not just to Daniel, but to the room itself, seeing it differently, not as a space she had to navigate carefully, but as one that was beginning to change. And as she stood there, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm, she realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just around her, but within her, and for the first time, the silence that followed did not feel like something she had to survive, it felt like something that was finally making room for her to exist. The room did not return to what it had been, and that was the first thing everyone felt even before they understood it, the absence of the old structure creating a quiet, unfamiliar space that no one immediately knew how to fill, and for the first time, Margaret did not step forward to claim it. Instead, she remained where she stood, her posture still composed, her presence still strong, but no longer absolute, and that difference, though subtle, shifted the entire atmosphere of the house. Daniel glanced briefly toward the staff, his gaze steady but not harsh, and with a small, almost imperceptible nod, something changed among them. Shoulders straightened, eyes lifted, not in fear, but in recognition, as if they were adjusting to a new set of expectations that did not rely on silent compliance but on clarity. Emily noticed it, the way the room no longer pressed in on her the same way, the way the air felt just slightly easier to breathe, and she found herself standing a little taller without thinking, her hands still resting over her stomach, grounding her, reminding her of what mattered beyond this moment. Beyond this house, beyond everything that had defined her place here. Until now, Margaret's voice came again, but it carried a different texture, no longer commanding, no longer shaping the room, but existing within it. "You believe this will solve everything," she said, and it was not quite a question, not quite a statement, but something in between, something reflective, and Daniel's response came without hesitation. "No," he said, his tone calm. "It will change everything." And that distinction settled into the silence like a quiet truth, one that did not promise ease, but promise direction. Emily felt that difference deeply, because for so long, everything had felt fixed, unchangeable, like a script she had been placed into without consent, but now, even without knowing what came next, she understood that the script had been rewritten, and that realization carried both relief and uncertainty in equal measure. The suited man closed the folder gently and stepped back. His role in this moment complete, but his presence still a reminder that what had happened here was not temporary, not symbolic, it was procedural, documented, enforceable. Margaret's eyes moved once more across the room, slower now, more deliberate, taking in details she had once controlled without effort, and though she did not step back, there was a stillness to her that had not existed before, a pause that suggested she was no longer directing the moment, but adapting to it. Daniel turned slightly, his body angling. Not away from his mother, but toward Emily, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to signal alignment, and when he spoke again, his voice softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in intention. "You should not have had to tolerate any of this," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that Emily felt immediately, because they acknowledged something that had never been acknowledged before. Something that had existed quietly beneath every interaction, every glance, every unspoken expectation. Emily did not respond right away, not because she did not have words, but because she was choosing them carefully, understanding that this moment was not just about what had happened, but about what it meant moving forward. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, quieter than the others, but no less present. "I did not think anyone would notice," she said, and the honesty of it settled into the room with a softness that contrasted everything that had come before. Daniel met her gaze again, this time holding it a fraction longer, and though he did not say more, something in his expression made it clear that he had noticed, that he had seen more than she had realized, and that what came next would not ignore that truth. The house remained silent, but it was no longer the same silence, it was no longer something that concealed or suppressed. It was something that marked a transition. A boundary between what had been allowed and what would no longer be accepted. And as Emily stood there, feeling the steady movement beneath her palm, she understood that this moment was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a space where she could finally be seen. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, softened at the edges, as if the house itself was adjusting to a new rhythm, and for the first time, that rhythm did not revolve around Margaret. She remained standing where she was, her posture still composed, her expression controlled, but there was a stillness to her now that had not existed before, not the stillness of authority, but the stillness of recalibration. Of someone reassessing a world that no longer responded the way it once had. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, not because the situation was resolved, but because the direction had been set, and that mattered more than immediate comfort. He glanced briefly toward the console table where the documents rested, then back to the room, his presence steady, grounding, and without raising his voice, he spoke again. "This house is not a place for control," he said, the words simple, but deliberate. "It is a place for stability." And the distinction carried through the space, settling into the corners of the room, into the posture of the staff, into the quiet awareness that something foundational had shifted, Emily felt those words more than she expected, not because of what they promised, but because of what they corrected, the unspoken assumption that she had been something to manage, something to evaluate, something to fit into a structure that had never been built for her, and now, standing there, she felt that assumption loosening, piece by piece. Margaret's gaze moved to Daniel again, her eyes sharp. Still searching, still calculating, but no longer dictating. "And you believe you can redefine everything overnight," she said, her tone controlled, but no longer carrying the same weight, and Daniel did not challenge her phrasing, did not argue the timeline. "It has already begun," he replied, and the certainty in his voice did not rise, it settled quiet and firm, the kind of certainty that did not need reinforcement. Emily shifted her weight slightly, the movement small but intentional, her hand still resting over her stomach as she took in the room again, seeing it not as something fixed, but as something in transition, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what that transition might look like beyond this moment, beyond this confrontation. The staff began to move subtly, not leaving, not dispersing, but adjusting, stepping back into their roles with a new awareness, a new alignment that no longer centered on silent observation, but on a structure that had been clearly redefined in front of them. The suited man gave a small nod to Daniel, then turned and walked quietly down the hallway, his departure as controlled as his entrance, leaving behind only the quiet certainty of what had been set in motion. Margaret remained still for another moment, then straightened slightly, not in defiance, but in composure, reclaiming what remained within her control, her title, her presence, her identity. Even as the authority she once held had shifted beyond her reach, Emily watched her, not with fear, not with resentment, but with a quiet understanding that this moment was not about winning or losing, it was about change, and change did not always look dramatic, sometimes it looked like this, measured, quiet, undeniable. Daniel turned slightly more toward Emily now, his voice softer when he spoke again, not because the moment required gentleness, but because she did. "You are not alone here," he said, and the words were simple, but they landed with a depth that Emily felt immediately, because they addressed something deeper than the situation itself, something that had existed long before this moment and had gone unspoken until now. Emily met his gaze, holding it this time, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, and though she did not say anything in response, something in her expression shifted, something that had been guarded beginning to open, not fully. Not all at once, but enough to be seen. The house remained quiet, but it was no longer the kind of quiet that concealed, it was the kind that followed a decision, that marked a turning point, and as Emily stood there, feeling the steady movement beneath her palm, she understood that this silence was not empty, it was space, space for something new to take shape. The moment did not explode, it settled, and that was what made it powerful, because nothing in this house had ever needed to raise its voice to assert control, and now, control itself had quietly changed hands. Margaret turned her gaze away from Daniel for the first time, not in retreat, but in thought, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of the hallway, the polished surfaces, the carefully curated space that had once reflected her influence in every detail, and now seemed to reflect something else, something she could not immediately define. She took a slow breath, measured, deliberate, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady, but no longer absolute. "You have made your position clear," she said, and though the words sounded composed, there was a subtle shift beneath them, an acknowledgment that the moment could not be reversed with presence alone. Daniel inclined his head slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition of the statement, because this was no longer about persuading, it was about establishing, and that had already been done. Emily watched the exchange with a quiet awareness, her perspective changing with each second, not just observing the shift in power, but feeling the shift in herself, the way her posture had changed, the way her breathing had steadied, the way her presence in the room no longer felt like something fragile or conditional. Margaret's attention moved to her then, not sharply, not critically, but with a new kind of focus, as if seeing her differently for the first time. Not as an extension of a situation, but as a person within it, and though she did not speak to her directly, That look carried a weight that had not existed before, a silent recalibration of roles that had once been fixed. Daniel followed that glance, his expression unreadable for a moment, then shifting just slightly as he turned more fully toward Emily, closing the space between them not with urgency, but with intention, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm. But there was a clarity to it that had not been present before. From this point forward, you will not be placed in a position where your presence is questioned, he said, and the phrasing was deliberate, not dramatic, not emotional, but structured, like a boundary being written into place. Emily felt the words settle into her, not as comfort alone, but as recognition, as validation of something she had been navigating silently for too long, and for a moment, she did not respond, not because she could not, but because she wanted to feel the weight of it fully before speaking. The staff remained quiet, but their attention had shifted again, no longer uncertain, no longer divided, but aligned with the clarity that had been established, their stillness now a form of acknowledgment rather than hesitation. Margaret turned slightly, her posture still refined, her composure intact, but no longer central, no longer defining the space in the same way, and as she moved a step to the side. It was not a retreat, but an adjustment, a repositioning within a structure that had changed around her. Emily finally lifted her chin just slightly, her gaze steady now, meeting Daniel's without hesitation, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but clear. I understand, she said, and the simplicity of it carried more strength than anything she might have said before, because it was not just agreement, it was acceptance of a new reality, one she was no longer resisting or questioning. Daniel nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgment, and in that small exchange something settled between them, something that had not been present before, a shared understanding that did not need explanation. The house remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt like something waiting to be broken, it felt complete, like a chapter closing without noise, without spectacle, but with certainty, and as Emily stood there, feeling the steady movement beneath her palm, she realized that the moment she had once feared had passed, and what remained was something entirely different, something she had never been given before, a place within the room that did not depend on permission. The shift did not demand attention, but it held it, settling into every corner of the house with a quiet permanence that no one could ignore, and as the moment stretched forward, it became clear that nothing would return to what it had been, not because of a single decision, but because of the way that decision had been made calmly, deliberately, without room for reversal. Margaret moved first, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same controlled precision that had always defined her. Turning slightly toward the staircase as if following a path she had walked 1,000 times before, yet this time there was a difference, subtle but unmistakable. She was no longer leading the space, she was moving within it. Her heels clicked softly against the marble, each step measured, each movement composed, but the sound no longer carried the same authority it once had, it echoed differently now. As if the house itself had adjusted its response. Emily watched her go, not with the guarded tension she had once felt, but with a quiet awareness, recognizing that this was not an ending built on conflict, but a transition built on clarity, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze following his mother's movement, not with resistance, not with regret, but with a steady understanding of what had just taken place. And when he finally looked back at Emily, there was no urgency in his expression, no expectation, only presence. The staff began to disperse slowly, their movements careful but no longer hesitant, stepping back into their roles with a new sense of structure, a new understanding of where direction would now come from, and though no words were exchanged, the shift was evident in the way they carried themselves, in the way they no longer looked to Margaret for silent approval before moving. Emily exhaled softly, a breath she had not realized she had been holding, and as she did, she felt the tension in her body ease, not completely, not all at once, but enough to remind her that something had changed not just around her, but within her. Daniel took a step closer, closing the distance between them with a quiet intention that did not need explanation, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm, but there was a depth to it now, something more personal. There are things I should have addressed sooner, he said, not as an apology framed in emotion, but as a recognition framed in responsibility, and that distinction made the words land differently, more solid, more real. Emily met his gaze, holding it steadily, not searching for reassurance, but acknowledging what had been said, and though there were many things she could have responded with, she chose simplicity. "You address them now," she said, and the words carried a quiet weight, not dismissing the past, but grounding the present. Daniel nodded once, accepting that, not pushing further, not complicating what did not need to be complicated, and for a moment, the two of them stood in a space that felt entirely different from anything that had existed in this house before, not defined by expectation, not shaped by control, but by something quieter, something more balanced. The hallway remained still, the light from the chandelier casting soft reflections across the floor, the broken glass now cleared away, leaving no visible trace of what had happened, yet the moment itself lingered, not as something fragile, but as something permanent. Emily shifted her hand slightly over her stomach, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm, grounding herself in something beyond the room, beyond the house, beyond everything that had once defined her place here, and as she stood there, she understood that what had changed was not just the structure of the house, but the way she existed within it, no longer as someone waiting to be accepted, but as someone who already belonged. The house settled into a quieter rhythm as the last footsteps faded up the staircase, and for a moment, the space felt larger, not physically, but emotionally, as if something that had once filled every corner had finally been removed, leaving behind room for something new to exist. Emily remained where she stood, her posture steady, her breathing even, her hand resting over her stomach in a gesture that had become instinctive, grounding, and for the first time, she allowed herself to stay in that stillness without bracing for what might come next. Daniel did not rush the moment. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary words, because he understood that what had just happened needed space, needed time to settle, and that forcing movement too quickly would only disrupt what had begun to take shape. The light from the chandelier above softened as the afternoon shifted toward evening, casting longer reflections across the marble floor, and in those reflections, the absence of tension was almost visible. Not complete, not perfect, but present enough to be felt. Emily glanced toward the staircase where Margaret had disappeared, not with concern, not with fear, but with a quiet acknowledgment that the dynamic she had once navigated so carefully no longer held the same weight, and that realization did not come with triumph, it came with clarity, a steady understanding that the rules had changed and would not revert. Daniel followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at her. His expression composed but thoughtful, as if measuring his next words with the same care he had applied to every decision that had led to this moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low, even. "There will be adjustments," he said, not as a warning, but as a recognition of reality. "Not everything will feel settled immediately." And the honesty of it mattered because it did not pretend that one moment could resolve everything. It acknowledged that change, even necessary change, required time. Emily nodded slightly, her response quiet but certain. "I do not expect it to," she said, and her voice carried a steadiness that reflected the shift within her, not reactive, not uncertain, but grounded in what she had just witnessed, in what she had just been given. Daniel studied her for a brief second, not critically, but attentively, as if seeing her more clearly than he had before, not through the lens of circumstance, but as she was, present, composed, resilient in a way that did not demand attention but deserved recognition. The house remained still around them, but it no longer felt like a place that required silence to function. It felt like a place that could now hold conversation, presence, and difference without collapsing under it. Emily took a small step forward, not away, not retreating, but moving into the space that had opened around her, her movement simple, natural. And in that movement, there was no hesitation, no pause for permission, only intention. Daniel noticed it, the way she moved, the way she carried herself now, and though he did not comment on it, something in his expression shifted, a quiet acknowledgment that what had changed was not only external, but internal. Something within her had realigned with the new structure around her. "There are things we will need to discuss," he continued, his tone measured, not urgent. "But not here." And the choice of setting mattered because this space, this hallway, had been defined by something else for too long, and moving beyond it was part of what came next. Emily understood that without explanation, her gaze lifting briefly to meet his, then lowering again as she nodded, not out of deference, but out of agreement, and as they stood there, the distance between them no longer felt uncertain, it felt intentional, a space that allowed both of them to exist without pressure. The quiet returned. But it was no longer heavy, no longer restrictive, it was calm, steady, like a pause that did not signal the end of something, but the beginning of what came after. And as Emily stood there, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm, she realized that this moment, this stillness, was not something to move past quickly, it was something to recognize, because it marked the point where everything had begun to change in a way that could not be undone. They did not move immediately, and that choice, that restraint, allowed the moment to settle into something more than just a reaction. It became recognition, and in that recognition, something steadier began to take form. Daniel turned slightly, gesturing toward the adjacent sitting room, not with urgency, not with command, but with quiet intention, and Emily followed without hesitation, her steps measured, her posture calm. As if crossing an invisible line between what had been and what would come next, the room they entered was softer, quieter, the light warmer, filtered through tall windows that overlooked the estate grounds, and for the first time that day, the space felt separate from the tension of the hallway, not untouched by it, but no longer defined by it. Emily paused near the edge of the room, her gaze moving briefly across the familiar furniture, the arrangement unchanged, yet the feeling entirely different, and as she stood there, she realized that it was not the space that had shifted, it was her place within it. Daniel remained near the doorway for a moment, as if giving her the space to settle first, then stepped inside, closing the distance between them not completely, but enough to create a shared space that felt intentional rather than imposed. He did not begin with explanations or justifications, because he understood that what mattered now was not recounting what had been done, but acknowledging what would be done moving forward. There will be a restructuring of how things operate here, he said, his tone even, not clinical, but clear. Not only in the estate, but in the household as well. And the words carried the same steady weight as before, not dramatic, not forceful, but definitive. Emily listened without interrupting, her attention focused, her expression composed, because she was no longer listening from a place of uncertainty, she was listening from a place of presence, and that difference shaped everything. Daniel continued, his voice steady. You will have full discretion over your own environment, he said, and the phrasing was deliberate, not granting permission, but acknowledging autonomy, including staff assignments, scheduling, and any accommodations you require. And the structure of it mattered because it was not temporary, it was not conditional, it was integrated into the system he was describing. Emily felt the words settle into her slowly, not as something overwhelming, but as something grounding, something that replaced the uncertainty she had grown accustomed to with a sense of clarity she had not expected to feel so soon. She nodded once, not quickly, not reflexively, but with intention. I understand, she said again, and this time, the words carried a different tone, not just acknowledgment, but acceptance of a role she had not been allowed to define before. Daniel studied her briefly, not searching for reaction, but recognizing the shift in how she carried herself, the steadiness in her voice, the absence of hesitation, and though he did not comment on it directly, something in his expression softened slightly, not visibly, but enough to be felt. Outside, the light had shifted further, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden lines across the floor, and in that light, the room felt settled, not static, but grounded, as if the transition that had begun in the hallway had found its first point of stability here. Emily moved slightly, taking a seat near the window, her hand resting once more over her stomach, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm, and for the first time, that gesture did not feel like protection, it felt like connection, something calm, something steady, something entirely her own. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, then took a seat across from her, not opposite in distance, but aligned in presence, and in that quiet arrangement, something unspoken formed between them. Not fully defined, not resolved, but clear enough to hold the house beyond. The room remained still, but it no longer felt like a place defined by control. It felt like a place in transition, and as Emily sat there, looking out at the fading light, she understood that what had changed was not just the structure of the house, but the way her life would move within it, no longer shaped by what was expected of her, but by what she would now choose for herself. The light continued to fade beyond the window, stretching into that quiet hour where everything softened, where even the edges of a long day seemed to dissolve into something calmer, and inside the room, that same calm had begun to take hold, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to be felt in the way either of them rushed to speak, in the way the silence no longer carried weight, only presence. Emily sat still, her hand resting gently over her stomach, her breathing steady, her gaze drifting across the horizon as if seeing it differently now, not as distance, but as possibility. And in that stillness, she realized something that had not been clear before, that strength did not always arrive loudly, it did not always demand recognition, sometimes it arrived quietly, in moments like this, when the world around you shifted just enough to let you stand without resistance. Daniel watched her for a moment. Not intrusively, not analytically, but with a quiet awareness that had not been there before, and when he spoke, his voice was softer now, not because the moment required less clarity, but because it no longer required control. "There will be time to adjust," he said, and the words were not a promise of ease, but a recognition of process, something steady, something real. Emily nodded slightly, her expression calm, her voice quiet when she answered. "I am not afraid of that," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else she could have said because it reflected something deeper than confidence. It reflected change, a shift in how she saw herself within the world around her. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgment, and in that small exchange, something settled between them, not resolved, not defined, but understood. A foundation that did not need to be explained to exist. Outside, the last of the sunlight slipped below the horizon, leaving behind a softer glow that filtered through the glass, and inside, the room held that same quiet transition, not from tension to relief, but from uncertainty to clarity, a shift that did not erase what had been, but redefined what would come next. Emily adjusted her hand slightly, feeling the steady movement beneath her palm, and this time, she allowed herself to smile, not widely, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to reflect the change she felt inside, the quiet certainty that she was no longer navigating a space that did not see her, she was standing in one that finally did. Daniel rose slowly, not abruptly, not signaling an end, but simply moving forward, and as he did, he paused for a brief second, as if considering something unspoken, then continued toward the door, leaving it open as he stepped into the hallway, not closing the space behind him, not separating it, but allowing it to remain connected, open, unchanged. Emily remained seated for a moment longer, her gaze following the fading light, her posture relaxed, her presence grounded, and as she finally stood, there was no hesitation in her movement, no pause for permission, only intention, a quiet step forward into a space that no longer resisted her. The house beyond remained still, but it was no longer silent in the same way, it carried a different kind of quiet, one that did not suppress, but held, and as Emily stepped into a hallway, the echoes of what had once defined it were gone, replaced by something simpler, something steadier, something that did not need to be announced to be understood, and in that stillness, without words, without spectacle, the truth settled quietly into place. Some people do not lose power when they let go of control. They finally understand what it means to use it right.